Have you ever thought about how we, as individuals, can actually make a dent in these huge global problems,
Yeah.
like,
It
poverty?
feels so big, right?
Right. It's easy to feel kind of helpless, like, what can one person really do, when it comes to something as massive as global poverty?
Totally. But you know what's really cool is seeing how people are finding ways to help, like even on an individual level, across these incredible distances.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we are seeing a lot more of that. And that's actually what we are diving into today.
Okay.
It's really about this new wave of pro-social crowdfunding platforms
Oh, cool.
like Kiva and Zedisha.
I've heard of Kiva, yeah.
Yeah, the ones where like everyday people can directly fund loans to like small businesses and entrepreneurs in, developing countries. And what's really interesting about these is like they kind of turned the traditional lending model on its head, right?
Yeah. How-
So they're often collateral free and the interest rates are super low, like
Yeah.
sometimes even zero.
Wow, that's really different.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to be unpacking today. What is driving this? Like, why are people choosing to lend their money to complete strangers, often thousands of miles away, without the traditional safeguards?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, what's the motivation behind that?
Right, and we've actually got some really cool research to dive into today.
Oh, perfect.
We've got a study that took a deep dive into data from kiva.org, and they used like some seriously impressive machine learning to try to answer this very question. What motivates crowdfunders to lend on these international platforms?
That's fascinating. And it's Kiva specifically.
Yeah, Kiva specifically for this study, but there are lots of platforms out there,
Mhm.
and I think the insights from this one can really apply more broadly.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So at the core of all of this is something called pro-social motivation.
Okay, pro-social motivation.
And that's really just a fancy way of saying like the desire to help others.
To help others,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's like that deep down human thing where you see someone in need and you just want to do something to make their situation better.
And that's without any expectation of like getting something back. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not about like profit or personal gain.
It's just
It's just that inherent goodness.
right, wanting to improve their well-being.
Right. So that's the core driver. But, the world is complex.
Hmm.
So as we go through this, we're also going to look at some of the factors that can either like boost that pro-social impulse or actually make it harder to connect with and support those borrowers who are like in very different circumstances than our own.
That makes sense, yeah. So like what helps and what hinders, I guess.
Exactly. And by the end of this deep dive, hopefully, you'll have a much clearer picture of how individuals are playing a role in addressing global poverty in this like digital age
Yeah,
and how international business is being shaped by like these online platforms.
I'm excited to learn more about it.
Me too. Me
Yeah.
too. All right, so let's get down to brass tacks here. Why would someone choose to lend money to, someone struggling with poverty in a completely different country?
Yeah, that's like the million-dollar question, right?
Right, and the study we're looking at argues that people with this strong pro-social motivation, they're deeply concerned about inequality.
They see that gap, the difference between the haves and the have-nots,
Yeah, exactly. They see that gap and they want to close it.
and they're driven to do something about it.
Right, and it's not just like an abstract concern either.
No, it's not just thinking about it, it's actually taking action.
Right, the research actually suggests that pro-socially motivated people, they pay closer attention to and are more likely to select borrowers from countries with, demonstrably lower levels of income.
That's really interesting. So they're actually drawn to those borrowers who are facing greater economic hardship.
Exactly. So there's like a real emotional component to this.
Yeah, it's not just a logical, here's where my money can make the most impact.
It's also about empathy.
Right. Feeling for those who are less fortunate.
Right. And the researchers actually tested this with a specific hypothesis.
Like a prediction of what they thought they'd find.
Exactly. So hypothesis one in the study was that pro-social motivation is positively related to selecting poorer borrowers.
So the more you want to help others, the more likely you are to choose borrowers who are struggling financially, even across borders.
Precisely. And they found like pretty strong evidence for this in the Kiva data.
Wow. So the data actually backed up their hypothesis.
Yeah. And they used some fancy machine learning stuff to analyze all that data.
Oh, wow. So it's not just like someone went through and read every single loan application.
No, no, no. Way too much data for that.
Right. That makes
They use like sophisticated algorithms to find these patterns.
That's impressive.
Yeah. So it seems like, that instinct to help those who have less, it really does show up in people's lending choices on these platforms.
So it's not just talk, it's translating into actual action.
Yeah, exactly. Now, they did use a specific way to measure how core a borrower was in this study.
Okay, how did they do that?
So they primarily use something called GDP per capita.
GDP per capita. I've heard that before, but remind me what that is.
Right, so it's basically the average income per person in a given country.
Okay, so like how much money each person makes on average?
Right, so if a country has a lower GDP per capita, it generally means there's a higher level of poverty there.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And to be extra thorough, they also check their findings using other measures of poverty, like the country's overall poverty rate and something called the multidimensional poverty measure, which they got from the World Bank.
Okay, so they looked at it from a few different angles just to make sure the results were consistent.
Exactly. And they were. Like, they found the same pattern across those different measures, which gives us even more confidence in their findings.
So there's a strong link between wanting to help people and choosing to lend to those with less, but I'm guessing it's not always that simple, right?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. There's a big piece of the puzzle that we haven't really talked about yet.
Okay, what's that?
Well, think about it. These borrowers are often living in parts of the world that are very different from our own, right?
Yeah, different cultures, languages, all that.
Exactly. So how does that cultural difference play into lending decisions?
That's a great question. I'd imagine it could be a significant factor.
And it turns out the study actually looked into this directly. They called it cultural distance.
So, like, how different the lender's culture is from the borrower's culture.
Exactly. They defined it as like the differences in norms, religious beliefs, language, ethnic background, even like everyday practices between the lender's home country and the borrower's country.
So it's not just geography, it's about how different our ways of life are.
Precisely. And they actually had a specific hypothesis about this too.
Okay, what do they predict about cultural distance?
Well, hypothesis 2 suggested that cultural distance actually weakens the relationship between pro-social motivation and lending to the poor.
That makes sense. The more different someone seems, the harder it might be to connect with them.
Right, and the study's findings actually supported this hypothesis.
Oh, really? So the data suggests that cultural distance does act as a kind of barrier.
Yeah, the researchers believe it creates both cognitive and emotional barriers.
Oh, interesting. What do they mean by that?
So cognitive, that means like on a thinking level, it can be harder to understand the context of a borrower's life and their business if their culture is very different from yours.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, you might not understand their needs or the challenges they face as well.
Right, and then the emotional barrier, that's about empathy.
So even if you want to help, it might be harder to feel that emotional connection with someone who seems very different from you.
Yeah, and remember, we talked about how empathy seems to be a key driver of this kind of pro-social lending.
Right, so if the cultural distance reduces empathy, it makes sense that it would weaken the impact of pro-social motivation.
Exactly. So the more culturally different the borrower seems, the less likely it is that your initial good intention, that pro-social motivation, will actually translate into you lending them money.
That's a really interesting finding, but how did they measure something as fuzzy as cultural distance?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not like you can just pull out a ruler and measure the distance between two cultures, right?
Right, it seems pretty subjective.
Well, they use a pretty sophisticated method, actually.
Okay, tell me about it.
So it was based on the work of some other researchers, and they drew on data from these huge international surveys, like the GLOBE study and the World Values Survey.
I've heard of those. They ask people all over the world about their values and beliefs, right?
Exactly. So these surveys ask lots of questions about different aspects of culture, like how people view authority, how important they think individual achievement is, what their attitudes are towards gender roles, things like that.
So lots of different dimensions of culture.
Yeah, tons. And they compare the average scores for the lender's country and the borrower's country on all these different cultural dimensions.
Okay, so they can see how far apart the two countries are on each of these cultural aspects.
Exactly. And then they combine all that information into a single measure of cultural distance.
Wow, that's pretty clever.
Yeah. And again, to be super thorough, they check their results using a couple of other established ways of measuring cultural distance as well, just to be sure.
Always good to double check.
Right. So once they had all that data, they could really start looking at how cultural distance actually plays out in the real world of crowdfunder decisions.
Okay, so what did they find? Does cultural distance actually have a real impact on who people choose to lend to?
It does. Yeah, the results were pretty clear-cut. They found that when the cultural distance was small, like when the lender and the borrower were from countries with fairly similar cultures,
Yeah.
The lender's level of pro-social motivation had a really big impact on whether they chose to lend to a poorer borrower.
Okay, so if you really wanted to help others and the borrower was from a culture that was kind of like yours, you were much more likely to lend to them, even if they were in a poor country.
That's exactly it. But here's the catch. When the cultural distance was large, that connection almost vanished.
Hmm. So even if you were super motivated to help, if the borrower was from a very different culture, it didn't really seem to matter as much anymore.
Yeah, your pro-social motivation basically stopped being a strong predictor of whether you'd lend to them.
Wow, that's a really powerful illustration of how cultural differences can still be a major factor, even in this globalized, digitally connected world.
Right, it shows that even with the internet and all that, we still tend to connect more easily with people who are like us.
It's human nature, I guess.
Yeah, and it's something to be mindful of, right? If we
Oh,
really want to make a difference in the lives of people around the world, we need to be aware of these cultural barriers.
absolutely. So we've talked about the borrowers and about cultural differences, but what about the lenders themselves?
Yeah, good point. The study actually looked into that too, and it gets into like the role of experience.
Oh, interesting. So, like, does being a seasoned crowdfunder change how you approach lending decisions?
Exactly, that's what they wanted to know. So they came up with Hypothesis 3, which focused on whether a crowdfunder's prior experience with funding loans actually strengthened the relationship between their pro-social motivation and their likelihood of choosing a poorer borrower.
Okay, so the idea is that as you fund more loans, you get more comfortable with the process, and maybe you get better at understanding the needs of borrowers from different parts of the world.
Right, and maybe that experience helps you overcome some of those cultural barriers we talked about.
That makes sense. You've seen more, you understand more, so your good intentions can actually be more effective.
Yeah, that's the thinking. And guess what? The study found support for this too.
Really? So experience does matter.
It seems so. Experienced lenders, the ones who had funded a bunch of loans before, they were better at understanding the projects from poorer countries, even if those countries were culturally very different from their own.
Oh, that's really interesting. So they were able to look past those surface level differences and really understand what the borrowers needed.
Exactly. And because of that increased understanding, their pro-social motivation could shine through.
So their desire to help could actually have a bigger impact because they were more experienced.
Yeah, they weren't like tripped up by those cultural differences as much.
Makes sense. Now, how did they define experience in this study?
So they kept it pretty straightforward. They just looked at the total number of loans a crowdfunder had funded before.
Okay, so it's just a simple count. The more loans you funded, the more experienced you are.
Pretty much, yeah.
And what did they find when they compared, like, the newbies to the veterans?
Well, the difference was pretty striking. They found that experienced crowdfunders, as their pro-social motivation went up,
Yeah.
the predicted poverty level of the borrowers they chose also went up, significantly more so than for the less experienced crowdfunders.
So experience really does seem to amplify that desire to help.
It does, and it makes you wonder, is it because they develop a stronger sense of connection with the borrowers over time? Or maybe they just get better at spotting the projects that are most likely to make a real difference?
Yeah, could be a bit of both, right?
Right now, there's one more piece of this puzzle that I want to talk about, and that's the role of the borrower's identity.
Okay, how so?
Specifically, whether the business seeking the loan was owned by a woman.
Oh, interesting. So gender comes into play as well.
Yeah, and the researchers actually had a hypothesis about this too.
Of course they did. Always got to have a hypothesis.
Right, so hypothesis 4 was all about whether lending to women-owned businesses would strengthen the relationship between a lender's pro-social motivation and their likelihood of supporting poorer borrowers.
So they thought that maybe people would be even more likely to lend to women who were struggling financially.
Exactly, and the thinking behind this is, like, maybe people perceive women entrepreneurs, especially in less developed countries, as being, more vulnerable.
They might face more barriers to success, more discrimination.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that triggers a stronger sense of empathy in lenders who are already motivated to help.
Kind of like a double whammy of pro-social motivation.
Right, and the study actually found evidence to support this.
But they were right.
Yeah, they found that lenders with higher levels of pro-social motivation, they were indeed more inclined to fund loans for borrowers in poorer countries when the business was owned by a woman.
That's really heartening. It suggests that people are recognizing the unique challenges faced by women entrepreneurs in those contexts.
Yeah, and that they're willing to step up and support them.
That's really cool. Now, was this women-owned business thing like a separate category on Kiva, or how did they measure that?
It was pretty simple. Yeah, it was just a yes or no. The loan application either indicated that the business was owned by a woman or it didn't.
Okay, so it was a binary variable. Either it was or it wasn't a women-owned business.
Yeah, exactly. And when they crunched the numbers, they found a really clear pattern.
What was that?
For loans to women-owned businesses, that predicted poverty level of the chosen borrowers.
Yeah.
It increased much more dramatically as the lender's pro-social motivation went up, compared to loans to businesses that weren't owned by women.
So that extra layer of empathy for women entrepreneurs, it really does seem to make a difference.
It does. And it suggests that these platforms, like Kiva, they could have a real impact on promoting gender equality in entrepreneurship.
By channeling those pro-social impulses towards women who might need it most.
Exactly. So this is giving us a really fascinating glimpse into the motivations behind crowdfunder behavior.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of the onion, right?
Right. It's not just about cold, hard economics.
Yeah.
There's a lot of human psychology going on here, and these insights can help us understand how to make these platforms even more effective.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, can we talk a bit about how the researchers actually went about conducting this study?
Yeah, of course, they use some pretty advanced methods, like how did they even begin to measure something as abstract as pro-social motivation?
Right. It's not like you can put it under a microscope.
No, not at all. So, first of all, they used a massive data set from Kiva.org.
Okay, we talked about that. It was from 2010 to 2019, right?
Yeah, almost a decade's worth of data. And they specifically looked at the crowdfunders from the top 5 lending countries on the platform.
So the countries that were lending the most money.
Exactly, because those are the ones that would have the biggest impact on the overall lending patterns.
Makes sense. So this gave them a huge sample size to work with.
It was massive, over 4 million individual lending decisions.
Wow, that's mind-boggling.
Yeah, so to make sense of all that, they used machine learning.
Okay, the fancy computer stuff.
Right, and the way they did it was actually really cool. So when new lenders join Kiva, they have the option to fill out a little section explaining why they decided to lend, often starting with, like, I loan because.
Okay, so they can write a little bit about their motivations.
Yeah, and the researchers analyzed these free text responses using a sophisticated language model called BERT, combined with something called LSTM regression.
Wow, those are some technical terms.
They are. But basically, think of them as very advanced computer programs that are designed to understand the meaning and sentiment behind human language.
So they trained a computer to read those statements and figure out how pro-socially motivated each lender was.
Exactly, but they didn't just rely on the machines.
Okay, good. Always good to have a human check.
They also developed what's called a human coding scheme. So they had real people read a subset of those I loan because statements
Okay.
and categorize them into different levels of pro-social motivation.
So like not pro-social at all, kind of pro-social, very pro-social, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And then they use that human-coded data to train the machine learning model to automatically assess pro-social motivation in the much larger data set.
So they used human judgment and teach the computer how to do it.
Right. And to make sure the machine was on the right track, they also looked for specific words and phrases that were associated with pro-social behavior.
Like what kinds of words?
Oh, words like help and make a difference and improve lives, things like that.
Okay, so they had a few different ways of making sure they were measuring this pro-social motivation accurately.
Exactly. They really wanted to be confident in that measure because it was the foundation of their whole analysis.
Right, makes sense.
And besides all that, they also took into account a bunch of other factors that could potentially influence lending decisions, to make sure they weren't getting misleading results.
Like what kinds of things?
Oh, things like the proportion of loans from a particular country that were available on Kiva at any given time, the size of the loan request, the proposed repayment period, whether the loan description was provided in English or not, the sector of the borrower's business, like agriculture or retail or whatever.
So all those contextual factors that might make someone more or less likely to lend, regardless of their pro-social motivation.
Yeah, exactly. They even looked at some characteristics of the lenders themselves.
Like what?
Things like how long they had been registered on Kiva, whether they had uploaded a profile picture, and how actively they were using the platform.
So like, were they just kind of browsing or were they really engaged?
Yeah, and they also controlled for the lender's country of origin.
Okay, to see if people from different countries generally had different lending patterns.
Precisely so. They really tried to cover all their bases.
It sounds like they were very thorough.
Oh yeah, very thorough. They wanted to make sure they were isolating the specific effects of pro-social motivation, cultural distance, and experience.
And it seems like they did a pretty good job of that.
I think so, yeah. All right, so after all that number crunching and analysis, what does this all mean?
Right. What are the key takeaways for us listeners?
Well, the big one, I think, is that we have pretty strong evidence now that people's desire to help others, that prosocial motivation, it's a major driver of lending on these international crowdfunding platforms.
So it's really heartening to see that people are using these platforms to, like, put their money where their heart is.
Yeah, and it shows that these digital tools can really empower individuals to play a role in tackling global poverty.
It's a really cool way to connect people across borders and help those in need.
Absolutely, but, and this is a big but, the study also highlights the fact that cultural differences can still act as a significant barrier, even in the online world.
Yeah, we talked about that. It can be harder to connect with and support someone who feels very different from you.
Right, so even though these platforms make it easier than ever to lend money to someone on the other side of the world, those cultural differences can still make it hard to really understand their situation and feel that sense of empathy.
It's a reminder that technology doesn't solve every problem.
Exactly, but there's some good news here too.
Oh, okay. What's that?
Remember how we talked about how experience can help lenders bridge that cultural gap?
Yeah, the more loans you fund, the better you get at understanding borrowers from different backgrounds.
Exactly, and that means your pro-social motivation can actually have a bigger impact.
So experience is key, both for the lender and the platform, right?
Absolutely. Platforms could think about ways to, like, highlight experienced lenders or maybe even create mentorship programs.
Yeah, that could be really valuable.
And then we can't forget about the findings related to women-owned businesses.
Right, those were really interesting.
Yeah, they suggest that pro-social crowdfunding could be a really powerful tool for promoting gender equality.
Especially in developing countries where women entrepreneurs often face greater challenges.
Exactly. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking about getting involved in crowdfund lending, keep those women-owned businesses in mind.
It's a great way to make a real difference.
Now, what are some of the broader implications of all of this?
Well, for the platforms themselves, there are some pretty clear takeaways, right?
Yeah, like what?
Well, they could think about ways to encourage more intercultural exchange between lenders and borrowers.
Like how?
Maybe by highlighting stories that bridge those cultural gaps, or maybe creating opportunities for lenders and borrowers to, like, interact more directly.
Yeah, those are great ideas, and it seems like highlighting those experienced lenders would also be a smart move.
Definitely. Maybe they could even have, like, a badge or something that shows how many loans they've funded.
Oh yeah, like a little super lender badge.
Exactly. And of course, they should keep promoting those women-owned businesses.
Yeah, make it easy for people to find and support them.
And this research also has implications for, like, bigger picture stuff, like international aid and development, right?
Absolutely. It shows how these digital platforms can be used to channel individual generosity into meaningful action.
It's a really powerful example of how technology can be used for good.
And it also highlights the importance of understanding the human element, those psychological and cultural factors that influence how these platforms actually work in the real world.
Right. It's not just about building the technology, it's about understanding how people use it.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Yeah, I'm ready.
We've seen that prosocial motivation is a powerful driver of crowdfund lending, but we've also seen that cultural differences can be a real obstacle, and that experience and support for women entrepreneurs can help overcome those obstacles. So the question is, how can we, both individually and as a global community, leverage all of this knowledge to make these platforms even more effective at addressing global inequalities?
That's a big question and a really important one.
It is. Maybe it starts with each of us taking a moment to reflect on our own motivations.
Yeah, like, why do we want to help others? What drives that impulse in us?
And how can we become more aware of those potential cultural barriers so we can find opportunities to make a real difference, even across those divides?
It's about being intentional and informed.
Right. So this deep dive has shown us the power of individual action.
And the potential for technology to connect us and empower us to make a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, so let's take this knowledge and use it to build a more equitable world, one loan at a time.
Me too.